So you're here for a negotiating session. And as soon as I got up on the stage, somebody came up to me and said, "Are you a lawyer?" And before I knew it, I answered yes, because I didn't know what the consequences were going to be. But then she said, "Well, I expect big things. I expect to learn a lot." So no pressure on me in terms of what we're going to do today. Why am I here? I've written a book on negotiation. I think that's the main reason why they asked me to come do this negotiating session. But that is not me, or at least that was my last LinkedIn picture, so I'm hoping to actually get it updated with my new hair. So I'm going to go quickly through the slides, just disclaimer, I'm a New Yorker, I talk really fast, so if I'm going too fast, raise your hand, make a sign, wave, and let me know, and I'll try to slow down. I can't promise anything, but I will try to slow down. I don't have a New York, yeah, I know. So learning objectives for this session. I just want to let you guys know that everybody that I talk to about negotiation, a lot of people see it as something special that happens, that it's a thing that you either need to hire a lawyer to help you with, or that you're not comfortable doing on your own. But I think what I'd like to do in sort of the spirit of our opening speaker is to get you to change your mindset a little bit about negotiation after we're done with this session. Because I really feel like we negotiate all the time. When people say, "Well, how long have you been negotiating?" I say my whole life. Because I think what you don't realize is there are lots of opportunities to be negotiating where you're not actually conscious that that's what you're doing. You're communicating with another person to try to get them to change their behavior. As far as I'm concerned, that's a negotiation. Okay, so I want you to think very broadly about negotiation. What I'd like to do today is just touch on the things that you need to know as a negotiator, your style and your skills as a communicator, because obviously communication is the key to negotiation. How we maximize the value of our preparations. Preparations are really important in negotiations, but there are other things that are equally important. And then one thing that doesn't get talked about a lot in the sort of traditional negotiating theory is practicing compassion in the face of negativity, judgment, and hostility. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. That really goes to having difficult conversations, having conversations that we all would like to avoid having, reacting or not reacting, learning how not to react in a conflict situation when someone is being either really angry with you or overly emotional or in some way feels like you're being bullied or something, and how do we actually develop the skill set to deal with that? Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like this to be an interactive session, and so if you have questions as we go through the slides, please feel free to just raise your hand. I have a microphone, so I don't have to repeat the question. I will just pass the microphone or have one of my able assistants who are standing in the back help me with the microphoning. This slide is just because I'm a lawyer and I have to have Latin on at least one slide. So here is my one Latin slide. The thing I realized about negotiating theory is that we tend to describe negotiation in binary terms, right? We talk about win-win. That's two sides. Win-win, this side, that side. Yes, no, right, wrong. There's a lot of binariness in how we think about negotiation. And I just really want you to sort of explode your mind and open it. Again, as our psychic opening speaker talked about this morning, open your mind to other possibilities, right? Not right and wrong, maybe right, not right or wrong, right and wrong, maybe. So what is a transformative negotiator? By the way, this is the book. It's called The Transformative Negotiator. Changing the way we come to agreement from the inside out. So a lot of negotiating theory focuses on what you want. What are you looking for? What's your goal? How do you get there? My theory of negotiation focuses internally. And again, that's more of the sort of how do we maintain ourselves? How do we keep ourselves centered in negotiations? How do we know who we are in negotiations, what we want? And how do we react to our negotiating partner in that space? So that's my definition of a transformative negotiation. And we'll talk more about all of these elements. So 3 keys, just like this morning. Really, he is psychic because he basically knew everything that I was going to be talking about this afternoon. Knowing yourself, what you want and why, and knowing the same as much as you can about your negotiating partner. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Being connected to yourself. By the way, these slides are all going to be made available, so if you're scribbling, and you don't worry, that I think they make all the slide decks available at the end of the presentation. So connected to yourself. And then most importantly, and sometimes something we forget in the context of negotiation, is being mindful. Being mindful about what's happening in the moment. How am I going to deal with what's happening in the moment? And how do I stay focused? And how do I stay flexible, right? It's not always about being dug in. You've got to be able to be flexible in your negotiations. You've got to be able to react to someone in a way that's maybe a little bit out of your comfort zone, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So why do negotiations fail? Anybody have any ideas about why negotiations fail? Don't look at the slide. You're not allowed to look at the slide. Ideas? Yes.
Poor communication.
And your name?
Kimberly.
Kimberly, poor communication. And by poor communication, you mean lack of communication. What about when people are communicating, but they're not understanding each other, right? How often have you said something to someone, and then all of a sudden you realize what you said, what came out of your mouth, and what the other person heard were 2 completely different things, not even close. So yes, poor communication. Other reasons why negotiations fail. Yes?
And the unwillingness to understand the other side.
And your name?
Sumali.
Sumali says an unwillingness to understand the other side, right? A negotiation is at least 2 parties, could be more. I know people who negotiate with themselves, but let's put them aside for now. At least 2 parties, right? So if you have something you want to negotiate and you're trying to convince that person to change their behavior, you need to know what motivates that person. What is that person's why? Why are they at the table? Okay? It's not just about what you can get from that person. You've got to understand that person. So very good point. Other reasons? Yes, right there.
Lack of power.
Lack of power. And your name? Marjorie says lack of power. And we're going to talk about power and leverage. I actually have a whole chapter in the book that talks about power, leverage, power, and how it gets used in negotiations. But let me just say one thing, Marjorie. Power is perceptive sometimes. So we'll get back to that point. Remind me when we get to that place. I think I saw Ruth Ann raise her hand.
Unrealistic expectations.
Ruth Ann says unrealistic expectations. And that is a big reason why negotiations fail. One of many reasons why negotiations fail, right? Either you or the other person have unrealistic expectations about what the outcome of the negotiation should be, or even if a negotiation outcome is possible. So those are some of the reasons why negotiations fail. I also added 2 other categories. One is when you are not prepared for a negotiation, the likelihood that you will fail goes up. I don't think I'm telling you anything that is not just common sense. Right? If you go into a negotiation unprepared, you will probably not succeed in the negotiation. Also, I learned very quickly in my career when I started negotiating with people from different cultures that my brain and the way I think and the way I talk and the way I process is not the same if I'm talking and speaking and negotiating with someone, for example, in Japan, which was one of my very first big-time negotiations for Sun Microsystems. And I realized, well, it seems like we're so far apart, but when we sort of brought the cultural barriers, we broke them down and moved closer to the middle, it was much easier to get things done. But you have to acknowledge it. You have to acknowledge that there's a difference, that not everybody, when they say no, that it means no. It doesn't in some cultures. In some cultures, the first no, they expect you to ask again. And the second no, they expect you to ask one more time. And then you'll get to maybe, right? So if you don't know that, you walk away after the first no. You have no idea. So knowing about the different practices, and I have a couple of slides based on a really great book that talks about cultural differences that we'll get to in a bit. So before we even get started with our skills and our knowledge and anything that we need to evaluate and assess, I wanted to start with why. And again, a lot of what we talk about when we talk about negotiation starts with why. Why are you here? Not what are you asking for, but why. Because a lot of times what happens in negotiations, one of the reasons why they are not successful is because sometimes people are working at cross purposes, not at the what level, but at the why level, right? When you talk about purpose and mission, and you have two parties in a room, one party is a nonprofit, and the other party is a for-profit. Two very, very different whys, right? Very different expectations for outcomes when you have different whys. So start your negotiation, any negotiation you're having, with this kind of analysis. Why? Why are you negotiating? Not what do you want? That's the easy part. What do I want? And I have a handout for you guys. We'll do if we have time at the end, the what do I want? I want a raise. That's the most common thing that people ask for, right? I want a raise. But what I'm going to make you do is tell me why. Why do you want the raise? Don't say none of your business. Don't say because, I want you to really deeply be reflective and think about the why. Many times when people come together to negotiate, they're trying to solve a particular problem. But is there something that you haven't said that if I knew that about you, I would be able to solve that problem better? That's also a why, right? What do you have to let go of to reach agreement? Sometimes we have an idea about a desired outcome, and changing our mindset is the one thing that stands in the way between success and failure in negotiation. And believe me, I've had many failed negotiations. I've learned a lot of lessons. So when I say set realistic expectations, as Ruth Ann mentioned earlier, don't attach to outcomes, what I mean is have a vision of where you want to go and why you need to get there, but don't grab onto something and then not let go of it, right? Because you may be missing opportunities to maybe work around something. You may not be able to get to it in the straight line that you had plotted for yourself. You may have to do something else. So that's what I mean when I say don't attach to outcomes. Questions so far? Comments? Horror stories about negotiations that made you cry? Or the other thing that I like to start with, in addition to why, is a word you don't hear in negotiations: no. And I like to start with no because I think it's very freeing. So in our handout, I talk about what would the consequences be if your partner said no? And I don't mean the first no, the second no, or the third no of the Japanese negotiator. I mean actual no. Do you have a backup plan? How attached are you to the one thing that you were asking for that you said you needed, and when you hear no, you walk away? So that's what I mean by start thinking about ahead of time. What happens if they say no? What does that mean? Do I have a backup plan? Am I just going to take my marbles and go? Am I going to walk out the room and not deal with it? Or do I have something else that I might be able to offer? What's my counter to a no? Okay. So these are very straightforward, commonsensical things that we do all the time. Sometimes we just don't realize that we're doing them. But this is all about preparation. The next few sections of the slides are about preparation. What do you want and need? Why are you negotiating? And knowing yourself as a communicator. What kind of a communicator are you? I am a very logical, direct, it's probably because of law school. That's what happens when you go to law school. You're logical, you're direct, you're straightforward, you probably say things you shouldn't say. That's because I'm a Sagittarian, not because I'm a lawyer. And then you basically are hoping that the person that you're negotiating with understands you, understands your style, doesn't get like, I don't know, reactive to you. I sometimes can cause reactions in people with my style. And then you have to find out about your partner's style. Sometimes, you know, people like to talk like this in circles. And that's very hard for me. I'm following them because that's just how my mind works. So I'm going round and around with them until I just feel like I'm going to, you know, I have to excuse myself. Because I don't know, I don't understand that form of communication. Because it's not my way. That's how I grew up. I grew up in New York. What can I say? That's just how you do it when you're in New York. So knowing these things about your partner, knowing these things about yourself, all increase the chances that you're going to succeed in your negotiation. Because you'll be able to prepare for that. Right? You won't get like tossed away by someone who doesn't quite have the same communication style that you do. Now, I'm talking about style of communication. I'm not talking about sort of emotion in communication. That's a different subject. We'll talk about that in a few slides. Because that's really something very different from style. That's conflict. That's when negotiations get contentious. Okay? But we're going to talk about that. If you find out about your partner, the more you find out about your partner, the more you might be able to find shared interests and common ground. And there's no, in the days when I was doing negotiation, early on, I mean, I'm still doing negotiation, but in the days when I was hired in a company to do negotiation, we didn't have the internet. So we couldn't just look up someone and find out all about them on the internet to see what kind of a person they were, or perhaps to understand a little bit about what their interests are. Now, there's no excuse for not doing that. And I don't mean it in a sort of trivial way. I don't mean it like chit-chat, like just, you know, oh, your family, I see your family. No, not like that. I mean real connections with people, really understanding people, and that helps you understand who they are, what their motives are. Okay, it'll also help you understand what kind of a person they might be. But don't make assumptions about people. And I know a lot of times people make assumptions based on your biography. I know I was just in a session where we were talking about the imposter syndrome. And somebody said, yes, I feel like an imposter because culturally, I don't look like everybody else. I don't have the same, I don't feel like I belong. And there are all these other cultural things and external things that make me feel less and less like I belong. But don't make assumptions about people just because of what you've read on the internet or what you've seen about them. Get to know them, right? Don't make assumptions. So here's how you close the information gaps. Ask a lot of questions, be curious. See, all of these things, if you had a traditional negotiation theorist sitting here in one of these seats, they would say, oh no, you can't do any of those things. What does that mean, share information? You're not allowed to share. You're supposed to hide your information till the very last minute. No, my view is be open. Share things. You're going to get a successful negotiation much faster than if you were hiding things, or having an agenda, secret agendas. I went through negotiations like that in the corporate world. They're awful. I mean, they're terrible. They waste so much time. We went through a negotiation it was supposed to be a simple licensing agreement with a company, and it turned out that what they really wanted was to buy us. But they never told, that was never part of the agenda. So we agonized over this agreement. We kept taking out the exclusivity, they kept putting it in. We kept taking out the source code, they kept putting it in. And finally we were like, what is going on? Can we have the CEOs maybe talk to each other? And sure enough, when the CEOs talked to each other, they found out that the other CEO really just wanted to buy us so that nobody else could get the technology. Well, if I'd known that, I wouldn't have even started the negotiation because the answer was no. A solid no, not a first time, second time, third time. Solid no way. So sharing information, I think, is important in negotiations. I'm not saying that you walk into the room and you say, hi, I'm so-and-so, this is who I am, this is what I do, and by the way, here's my whole negotiating strategy and agenda. But at the same time, I feel like our tendency is to hide things or to not share things. So I'm trying to get you to do new things, try different things. And open, and I say empty because that's the Buddhist way of talking about an empty mind, but opening your mind to new possibilities. Okay, that's really important. Closed minds are probably number one reason why negotiations fail. Closed minds, right? People just they can't think of other options. They're so dug in that there's no other way around it, right? And there's no way to it or around it or behind it or anything. And I'm sure many of you have had those types of negotiations. So my view is that this is the number one skill that you need as a good negotiator and a good communicator, actually, listening. And we don't do it. I know I didn't do it. I never learned how to listen because all my training was talking. If the other person wasn't talking, I was preparing what I was going to say. I was getting ready to answer a question, or I was thinking about what I was going to say next. So I was not a good listener. Trust me, I learned the hard way. But I think it's one of the most important things that we can do as communicators and negotiators, is be good listeners. What does that mean? It just means being present. That's really all it means. It means being present. It means really hearing the other person. It means sometimes just parroting back what the other person said just to make sure that you understood what they really meant, right? That, let me tell you, when you say listening, everybody thinks, oh, that's just so passive. You just sit there, you listen. It is hard work. Listening is really hard work. You guys are working really hard right now, I can tell. What I'm saying is, it's something that you have to practice. Okay. I'll say this for myself. It was something that I had to practice. Some of you may be really, really good listeners, but I was not a really good listener. I was a talker. That's all I did was talk. Talk. So that's not very good for listening. The other thing is that some listeners, like me, were only listening to figure out if I could fix your problem, because that's what I got paid to do. I got paid to fix problems. So you'd be telling me something like, well, my husband, this, and something happened with my child, and I'm thinking, oh, I know, you can do X, Y, Z. And I'd interrupt them, and I'd give them the answer, and I thought, oh, my job is done. That was not why they were talking to me. That was not the intention. I completely misread it. It happens all the time. I still do it. It's hard. You have to practice listening. It's not easy. So how many people think that they're good? Show of hands. Feel like that now that you've heard my story. How many people feel like they really know how to listen? Oh, okay. That's good. That's great, because that's way better than I would have expected. Yeah. We'll see. We'll see that. I'll test you on that one. So how do you speak? The very first answer to why do negotiations fail was lack of communication, poor communication. And that has a lot to do with ambiguity, with clarity, with what are you saying, how are you articulating it. What is your body saying? What does your body language say when you're speaking, right? A lot of people ignore the body language cues, but I find that they're very important, especially in negotiations. It is true that when you are closed in your body language, you are going to be, oh, I think I just messed my mic up, sorry. You are going to be closed, right? If you're open in your body language, you're going to be more open. Okay, it's very simple. It's not rocket science. And remember that words matter. Words matter. I just want to say that again. Because I think what happens is people are not very mindful sometimes about what they're saying and how they're saying it. And you can derail a negotiation very quickly just with a single word. A single word. Okay, so I just want you to, as you're going through this, as you're learning these, and I know most of you, these skills are, you already do them, but it's just bringing awareness and focus to them when you're in negotiations. So here's where more gaps. We get more gaps in negotiation. Because remember, negotiation is just about getting the people together, aligning them and getting them to agreement. So here are the types of things that can get in the way. And we all have these. Every single one of us has at least one, if not all of them, right? We have triggers. You could be saying something to someone, and all of a sudden, you're getting a different person on the other side of the table. And you don't know what happened. It was some kind of trigger that you didn't even know you pushed that button, right? It's not about you. It's something that they are reacting to. And we have our own, right? We have our own triggers. We have our own filters. I have a terrible filter. My filter, don't laugh, and I hope I don't offend anyone. I have a problem with people who have Southern drawls, okay? It's just that I don't know where it came from because I was not exposed to a lot of people with Southern drawls living in Manhattan. But for some reason, my assumption, my filter, my bias is that people who are from the South and speak in a Southern drawl, first of all, they speak very slowly, and that's hard for me. But the second thing is, I associate that with that they're not smart. Where did that come from? Nope, my parents didn't teach me that. That wasn't something I learned in school. But for some reason, that was my bias, that someone who came and spoke to me with a Southern accent, a heavy Southern accent, I immediately assumed that that they were not that bright. That's not true. But I had that. That was one of my biases, and so I had to overcome that. Now, I will say, there was only one person that I negotiated with who had a very strong Southern accent, and she was very smart, really, really smart. She totally out-negotiated me. But what I'm saying is, you have to know this about yourself, right? This is the self-examination that I'm talking about when you're doing your negotiation prep. What are you bringing into the room with you, or what baggage are you bringing on this journey, right? Who are you in terms of how you process information, how things get filtered through your brain? Like I said, I'm a very logical thinker, and so if you're giving me a lot of stuff, I'm going to go right there and I'm going to just pick it out, and that's it. The rest of it is just completely irrelevant. Well, that's great for some things, but not great for everything, right? So I know that about myself. So I try to quiet that in me, right? I try to make sure that the person can lay it all out, and then I can say, oh, I heard you. It's so hard to say that. I just want to pick that thing out. But oh, I heard you. So how can I help you? How can I support you? What is it that I can do? It's very difficult. Your first reaction is sometimes just the thing that you've been doing for your whole life. So, and these are probably the hardest things, I think, the cognitive gaps. So cultural gaps, these next two slides I'm going to go quickly through. The book is called When Cultures Collide. And what it is it's like an encyclopedia of different cultural aspects, different cultures and their cultural aspects. And I mean everything. It's even a great travel guide. If you're going someplace and you want to know, well, what's it like if I go to Saudi Arabia? What kind of cultural things not even a negotiation, just more like even to go someplace and to be interacting with the local population. It's a really, really great book. But for negotiations, it's nice to know who you're dealing with. Are you dealing with someone who's mostly reactive, who's going to avoid confrontation at all costs? Or are you dealing with someone who's confronting with logic? That's me. I'm confronting with logic, right? And so those two different styles and different cultural backgrounds are going to create gaps. You just have to figure out a way to get around them. So these things are not things that stop negotiations, they're just things to be aware of, right? How are decisions made? If you're negotiating for someone, are you talking to the right person? Now, in our culture, a lot of people are given decision-making authority. Sometimes in Eastern cultures, you have to go to a tribal place to get your decision made. You have to go to a tribal council. The decision doesn't get made with the individual negotiator you're dealing with. It needs to get approved at a much higher level, right? So negotiators need to be aware of these things before you go into the negotiation, because it's going to save you a lot of time. And then finally, walk in your partner's shoes. Try to figure out, what is this person? Who is this person? Why is this person? And can I stand in their shoes even for a minute to understand what they need and what they want? Right? That's really important. Most negotiators teach you how to stand in your own shoes. And it's only your own shoes that really matter, because you're the negotiator and it's your deal and you need to get what you need to get. But there's another party there. There's another party, or sometimes multiple parties there, that you have to take into consideration. So that helps close those gaps. Okay, questions so far? All right, I'm moving in a good pace. Yes?
Can you speak to negotiating on an email contact? So a lot of what I'm hearing so far is about face-to-face negotiation.
Yes.
And a lot of, in my line of work, it's a lot of email and negotiating through that platform.
So the question was, can I speak to negotiating in email? Yes. So that would be a whole other session. I'm happy to come back next year if you'd like to hear about No, I'm kidding. I think what happens, all of these rules apply no matter how you're negotiating. So in the book, I talk about that face-to-face negotiation is the best, but I do recognize that we've evolved slightly in how we do business. The book was published in 2015, but it took me a really long time to write, so I was writing kind of in the early 2000s. So I understand that there are other platforms. I talk about negotiating on the phone, which is my second best option, and then email is my only if you really have to option. The problem with email, there are two problems that I see with email. One is that there's one good thing about email, if you're very disciplined. You can write and rewrite your email about 1,000 times until you think you get it just right, and I guarantee you as soon as you press send, you're going to go, uh-oh, I forgot that. They're going to read that, and I'm going to, okay. 30, exactly. So that's the one sort of good and bad thing about email. What I will say is that the hardest thing about email from a negotiation perspective is that the way you write it and the tone that you use in your head when you're writing it, if it came with I'll read this email to you in my tone, in my nice, soft tone, everything, that'd be great, but it doesn't. It just comes at you, and everybody's got a different tone in their head when they're reading it. It's not your tone, I guarantee you. And so what happens is major misunderstandings, sometimes conflicts, sometimes blow-ups. So what I like to do is I like to tell people that a phone call is, if you are not anywhere near the person physically, that a phone call, at least at the beginning, is better, that I would use the email to summarize and then ask, just like you were doing a listening activity, you summarize it and say, thank you so much. What I heard on the phone or what we agreed to is XYZ. Please let me know if that's right. And then let them respond. Because it takes a little bit of that tone element off and gives you a little bit of, I won't say it's always perfect, but it's a little bit better to start with a phone call, because at least with a phone call, you can assess tone. You can't assess body language. You can't assess, any of that. The one thing I will say about phone negotiations, and I talk about this in the book, is that you definitely need to make time for it, right? I know people who, they schedule the phone negotiation, and you can hear them when you're negotiating with them on their computer, and there's music, and there's a band playing, or something's going on, and they're not paying attention to anything you're talking about. So don't be afraid to say, oh, it sounds like this might not be the best time. Should we reschedule? I mean, it's really about making sure you're present and they are present. And if you're doing it any way other than me and you in a room together, you need to kind of bring that into the room with you, okay? If you can. But I do realize that it's not easy because we do a lot of negotiation over email. We do. But that was a great question. Other questions about what we've gone over so far? Okay. So when you're negotiating, again, this isn't just face-to-face, because you could actually be doing this when you're on the phone or when you're, if you're doing it in your office or you're doing it via Skype or whatever. Most of the time, we think about negotiation as a mental activity, but it is not. It is a full-body sport, right? Everything is connected. So you can't just separate your head and say, oh, my head's not in it. You've got to get your head in it, but you also have to have all the rest of you come along with you, right? There are times when you are not in a place to negotiate. You're tired, you're just getting over a cold, you're rushed, whatever it is from a physical, external standpoint, you want to make sure you factor that in before you schedule your negotiations. Now, sometimes there is no way you can actually plan for these things, right? I mean, I remember one of my first big negotiations at Sun. I was negotiating with I forgot the name of the guy who did COBOL something, and he was like Richard Stallman. We were doing a deal with Richard Stallman's company, and I'm blanking on the name, but he was a very hard negotiator, and I couldn't get him to back off of his negotiation. We then had to do a deal with a British company, and they basically told us that they had until March 31st at midnight to do the deal, which we'll talk about ultimatums in a second. But what happened was the team flew in from the UK. They came to our place. The negotiation started at noon. They went to 9 o'clock at night. We were not done. I'm usually asleep by 9 o'clock at night, okay? So I got in. I was all excited. It was my first big deal. This was at a time when I actually, don't laugh, I had to wear a suit and heels and pumps. Not happening anymore, but I had to. And so I was sitting in that room, and these are all guys from the UK. They all smoked. And at that time, you could make them go outside, but they left the doors open, all the smoke. I think I had a migraine, a stomach ache, I was tired, this was not optimal. And then my boss was telling me, just do it. Do not leave that room until you get a signature. So I woke him up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I said, this is a crappy deal. I'm just telling you right now, it's really crappy. It's not gonna last. He said, great, is it ready? Sign it. And then I got a big bonus, and I was thinking to myself, this is awful, it's terrible, it's the worst deal. I can't believe this is my first experience, and I was just in the worst place. And I said to my boss, 3 days later, he was like, that was so great, what a great worker. I'm like, oh my God. And I said, I give it 3 months. 3 months. Okay, it was 6 months, and they sued us for breach of contract. Right? Because why? Because I was just doing stuff that we never would have done if I'd been in my right mind. But I went through everything with him. He said, yeah, that's all right. Don't worry about that. No, don't worry about that. Little did I know, he knew less about software licensing than I knew at the time. So it was like, okay, the blind leading the blind, a terrible deal. We shouldn't have done it. I was in no place to actually negotiate that deal. But I learned, right? I learned from that what I saw as an epic failure, even though I got a bonus. So from the perspective of, did I do a good job as an employee for Sun? Yeah, I did a great job. They were very happy. Okay, one of the things that people talk about, and I want to just briefly go through it, and then we're going to kind of do the exercise and have a little more fun. How do you trust? So trust is an important element in negotiations. How do you trust? All right. How many people think they are, based on this definition, high trust individuals? Show of hands. Yeah. Okay. That's pretty good. Low trust individuals. That's usually the majority of people think of themselves as, you need to prove to me that I can trust you. right? That's how they go into a negotiation. You need to prove to me that I can trust you, right? The other group all walk into the negotiation going, you're great, and I'm gonna trust you until you make me not trust you, right? So those are two very different ways of looking at the universe, and they affect negotiations, right? Are you trustworthy? Is your partner trustworthy? How do you know that? You know that because they keep their word, right? And it can be little things. It can be very small little things. It doesn't have to be big, gigantic things in keeping their word. So just know what kind you are. I'm not saying one is better than the other, and I'm not telling you what kind of person I am, what trust person I am. I grew up in New York. You already know what kind of person I am. So how to build trust. This is all based on Stephen Covey, 13 behaviors. And he's got 13 of them. I just picked 6 because those 6 are the same 6 that I write about in the book. So listen first, talk straight, make sure you're clear. We already saw all those. Then demonstrate respect, keep your commitments, and extend trust, meaning he views negotiations as ways to actually give the other party a chance to show that they are worthy. I remember one negotiation with a Japanese company, and before we even started the negotiation, like before we even knew the business terms, they flew an entire team out to Sun. Why? Because they wanted to see if we were trustworthy partners. Okay, so they were assessing us. They were assessing our values, right? Our company would never have done that with a negotiating partner. We didn't care. And, but that was really almost more important than what was on the paper, than what we ultimately agreed to at the end. So just know that these things do form the basis of negotiations. Framing is very important in negotiations. That's all I'm going to say. Because I think when you are dealing with negotiations and dealing with what you want and what you need and why you need it and all that, you need to be mindful of the frame you're putting around it. How are you framing it? In law school, we learn how to frame an issue so that the answer will be yes. That's really, there's a class. It's just that's what you do. You learn over and over again. You learn how to take a complicated problem, frame it in a way that makes the court say yes. All they have to do is say yes. That's the answer that you want. Or no, if the answer is no. And you learn how to do that. But we don't teach people how to do that in school. People don't learn how to do that. So you have to practice framing, and you have to do it over and over again. Right? How do you present something to someone so if you want a yes, you present it in a way that compels them to say yes. They have no other option but to say yes. It takes a lot of practice, I'll tell you that right now. So somebody was asking about power and leverage. So leverage is the ability to influence people. Common forms of leverage: money, competition for money. What do I mean by competition for money? I read a book by Herb Cain a long time ago. Cohn, not Cain. Herb Cain was the guy who wrote for the San Francisco Chronicle. He wrote a book, and in the book he talked about buying just anything, going into a store and buying something. He said, don't think of it as going into a store and buying a refrigerator. He said, when you're negotiating, I want you to think about it, that you're going into a store to make the store compete for your money. Oh, well, that's different. I mean, it kind of blew my head. I was like, wait, but I thought I was just going in to buy a refrigerator. No, I'm not going to buy a refrigerator. I am going in and I am going to tell that guy, so why should I buy a refrigerator from you? There's like 200 other places I could buy a refrigerator. Come on, let's see your song and dance. Let me see, what do you got? What's the best price? All that. It never dawned on me. You just go in and buy a refrigerator. No, you make people compete for your money. Right? And that changed my whole way of buying things. I never bought anything the same way again. Cars, God, it doesn't matter what it was. I was like always making people compete for the money. So it is kind of annoying sometimes, but I didn't stay in the same store over and over again. Sometimes your level of optimism or pessimism can be leverage. So I sometimes tell the story about the Ben & Jerry's antitrust lawsuit. I don't know if you guys are probably too young to know anything about the Ben & Jerry's antitrust lawsuit. There was a time when Ben & Jerry's was being bullied by Haagen-Dazs. Okay, believe it or not. Now, this is my favorite story because I love Ben & Jerry's and Haagen-Dazs, so how could this not be a good story? Of course, Ben & Jerry's was the startup in those days. And Haagen-Dazs was the big bad Pillsbury, right? They got bought by Pillsbury during the course of this little conflict. Haagen-Dazs was trying to make sure that their distributors didn't carry any Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Right? They were changing their agreements so that they only had to carry Haagen-Dazs. So Ben & Jerry's is like, well, that's not fair. But they couldn't beat them by just saying that's not fair. So they got very creative. And the thing they did that I thought was brilliant is they started to sell with their Ben & Jerry's pints. They put wrappers on their Ben & Jerry's pints of ice cream that had an 800 number that you could call. It was the customer service line for Pillsbury. And they were telling people that if you call and tell them to stop picking on Ben & Jerry's. Then they took out ads, big giant billboards, and ads on buses that said, and it had the Pillsbury Doughboy on it, and it said, "What's the Doughboy afraid of?" Right? So they had this whole marketing campaign. It was all about the people. It was all about getting the people, their customers, to do all the work for them. And, Haagen-Dazs settled. The Pillsbury was like a big, one of the big companies with the shiny, reputation. And they're like, well, we don't want anybody thinking we're picking on this company, even though they were. So they settled. But, it wasn't because of the lawsuit. It was because of the people. That's the ice cream case study. So things that I don't like to see in negotiations, these kinds of ways of doing leverage. Of course they are leverage, but I don't like to see these things in negotiations. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, especially ultimatums. Ultimatums are really bad for negotiations. Like that whole, this has to be signed by March 31st or else. And you're thinking, guess what? We didn't sign it. It was after midnight on March 31st and nobody fell into the ocean. So it really forces you to do stuff that you probably wouldn't do, right? Okay. Quickly, having difficult conversations. None of this is new because we just went over all of it. Prepare, be clear, be neutral. Try to use temperate phrasing. That's the one that always gets me, that last one there at the bottom. I tend to raise my voice. I think it's just because I grew up in New York. I blame everything on growing up in New York. But what happens is I raise my voice because when I was growing up, I would have dinners with the family. There were only 4 of us. It wasn't like there was a big crowd of people or anything. But I learned that if you wanted to get a word in edgewise in my family, you had to really let it out. So I learned to raise my voice when I was trying to make a point. Right? Unfortunately, that triggers a lot of people. Remember that slide about triggers? So people would hear me with a raised voice and they'd be like, why are you mad at me? Why are you screaming? I'm like, this isn't, oh, you want to hear screaming? I'll give you scream. This is not screaming. So temperate phrasing and figuring out the right words and how to say them and what tone to use, that was probably the biggest thing that I had trouble with. I have chapters in the book on all of these things, on how to manage emotion. The one I spend a lot of time on is cultivating compassion. But also, I learned that using the mirror is a really good tool. Like when somebody is being like a bully, or somebody is really screaming at you or treating you with disrespect, you can just, stop them. And I don't mean talk to the hand. What I mean is stop them in the sense of saying, I can't hear you when you're screaming. Think about that phrase. I can't hear you when you're screaming. I've used that. It stops them in their tracks. They're like, I'm screaming. Of course, no. Oh, okay. So You've got to come up with ways that you can diffuse situations, especially if you're negotiating over and over with the same people, right? You learn about the people that you're negotiating with and what their triggers are or how they deal with things. So using the mirror is sometimes a really great way to stop it in its tracks. Doesn't always work. Sometimes they're just too dense to get it that you're actually reflecting something back to them that they're like, yeah. The other thing is try to get at what's going on. Sometimes when someone's angry, most of the time, it's not about you. It's about something going on. What happened? Maybe this isn't a good time to negotiate with you. Oh, we're doing our performance review, and you're stabbing with your pencil on the paper. No, maybe let's reschedule. I don't think this is a good time. Find your cues, figure out what's going on. Remember, you have to know what your partner's going through, right? There are good times and there are not so good times. And you don't want to be doing a negotiation in a not so good time. And then this one's the one that gets me every single time because nobody ever plans for walking away. Everybody feels like, I've got to get it done. It's got to be negotiated. We've got to come up with an answer. And the fact of the matter is, sometimes the answer is not getting to yes. Sometimes the answer is goodbye, right? It's good, see ya. And you have to be the judge of whether something is tipping over into, I could put more energy into this negotiation, but based on the way they've been treating me so far, or based on the fact that they've been less than truthful with me, or disrespectful outbursts, do I want this person in my life? Do I want this thing? Do I want to continue this relationship? What is it that you really want? And you have to look at what's happened before, right? Because a lot of people think you sign an agreement, you put the agreement in a drawer, and everyone gets happy after that. Oh, it's great. It was a very contentious negotiation, but now we're just so happy. No, they're not happy. They're really not happy. They're going to be just like that. If you have a continuing relationship with those people, you have to deal with that behavior in the future. Don't think that the switch just goes off and all of a sudden they become really helpful and happy and glad that they negotiated a deal with you. No. If they have been behaving badly during the negotiations, the likelihood is they will continue that behavior. And it's happened to me 3 times. 3 times I told them, don't sign this deal. 3 times it ended up in litigation. So I know what I'm talking about. I know this from experience, right? You have to take that into consideration. Yes, ma'am.
So I need you to go and be a part of the negotiation team with DirecTV and CBS. They walked
Do I get a show out of it?
We could do that.
Okay, I'm in.
They walked away, and now their customer is left without a channel. So I'm left without some of my favorite shows. And I'm a little peeved about it. So now you're telling me.
All right, offline. We'll go take it offline to come up and talk to me after. Okay, so I think I have like 3 minutes. There's the thank you. Do your evaluations. Be good citizens. Give me a great rating. I'll be back next year. But here's the thing. On most of the chairs, there's some up here if you don't have one, and I will also be making them available with my slides, is a homework assignment. So the next time you have, this is actually for asking for a raise, okay? That's the way I put it in. But I want you to use this cheat sheet, and I want you to fill these things in based on what we've talked about today, okay? Because it goes over everything that I zoomed through. And hopefully you retained a third of it, which would be great. But if you have questions, you can email me. You can call me. I am happy to do mentoring. I am happy to help you with negotiations. I'm happy to do anything that relates to negotiating at Berkeley. I probably can't do the outside stuff because it would be a conflict of interest. But anything that comes up that relates to negotiations at Berkeley, I can probably help you with in an informal capacity. So take those. If you have some on your chairs, just collect them in your row and then leave them on the table, because some people in the back I actually did not anticipate so many people, so there are some that did not have papers on their chairs. Any other final questions before I let you go on time? Final issues? Anything? Anyone? No? Thank you so much. I appreciate it.